Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
And Pete, thank you very much, Peter, for that handsome introduction. So I'd like to invite people to just close their eyes. And I'm aware of my heart rate elevated. And as I say that, it starts to slightly slow down. I'm aware of a tingling in my hands. I'm still aware of the heartbeat really there. Yeah, and a desire to say the right thing, to come across well. Been feeling quite a lot of fear through my system over the last couple of days, and I'm watching as that's kind of coming into this space, but as I'm speaking it, part of it fades away. So I'd like to invite you to open your eyes. And if anyone here, if you know what I mean, if you can get a sense for the coherence of the group space. And just track, when is the group more in coherence? And when does it fall out of coherence? And what I seem to have found in my own journey with truth, trauma, not so much technology, is that our trauma, for example, that is causing the slight performance anxiety in me, the sense of wanting to be good, the way I'm kind of holding myself. That trauma stops us from tapping into actual truth. Because trauma leads to a suppression or a dissociation from our current predicament. It's a fragmentation between thought and emotion. And yeah, I just wanted to start this way to really kind of experiment with bringing a certain level of emotion into the space. On one level, because I feel that it is actually the most important part for us to start building collective coherence. So with that, I'll kick off. Yeah, so this is about a trauma, truth, and technology, the 3 T's. And I believe that the first 2 are at the core of what is going on or wrong in society. And when I speak about trauma, I mean trauma on the level of the individual, trauma on the level of the collective, and trauma intergenerational too. And it's my belief that, and maybe many of you share lots of these beliefs, that the vast majority of negative or malevolent actions we see in the world are not the result of psychopathy. Much of them are, but most of them are the consequence of unresolved developmental trauma. And I think what Peter has done with the Stoa, this like invitation for us to bring, almost like, Peter, I don't know if you'd agree with this, but it's like we're almost like trying out a new way of being. It's like a new way of practicing, of doing things. And I strongly, strongly believe that a huge part of how we're going to transcend our current predicament is how we allow trauma into our relational fields. And realizing that so much incoherence, be it politically, be it socially, be it just intersubjectively, is a consequence of us not having the capacity to integrate thought, feeling, and emotion because of undigested trauma. There's another piece that I think is important to I'm just putting little flags on the ground here. There's individual trauma as the basis of many of our negative predicaments, but there is also collective trauma. And we could kind of go down a Jungian pathway here, but I think it could be much more simple than that, which is that when you have a predicament like the Holocaust, the trauma of that time embeds and manifests itself both biologically and culturally. And so the stories and the narratives that people tell post-war, they kind of linger in the energetic cultural space. And then there's intergenerational trauma, which, as a lot of you know, you call it ancestral trauma, is really the epigenetic, we are carrying the epigenetic residue of so many of our ancestors. And I think what a lot of these kind of meta-modern sense-making conversations lack is that there's a hell of a lot of abstraction, right? It's all meta, it's all sense-making. And though people often speak to embodiment, they don't speak from embodiment. And I can often say this in my own life, right? This is why I wanted to kind of try out a little bit more vulnerability than usual, is because I can track in myself when I'm going meta, because I should really be going meta, vis-a-vis when I'm going meta, because I've learned a behavioral pattern to dissociate. And I just want to emphasize, in this sense-making community, I'm kind of like going on the war footing straight away, but in this sense-making community where I deeply believe there is a lack of embodied speech. And I put myself in that category of someone who struggles to articulate from that place. And again, like I said, the consequence of that, the result, it is the symptom of trauma. And the consequence of that is actually a lack of coherence in the space. I went to a sense-making party in San Francisco a few months ago, because that's what we cool kids do in the Valley. And everyone was talking, the theme of the night was coherence. And everyone was talking about coherence. Every single person was talking about coherence, but it was literally, it was from the most abstract, rational place. And the group shifted when people started opening up from a more embodied place. And you can feel that when that happens, right? Can you guys like nod when you can like feel when like a group coheres? So anyway, I wanted to start with that. I feel that the developmental trauma is the most underlooked yet most important aspect of us building coherence, building sense making, and building collective intelligence moving forward. And in order for us to do that, we have to come into the discomfort of being embodied.
I had no idea what you were going to talk about today, but like I'm pleasantly surprised, because this maps over to a lot of the discussions I've been having personally with a lot of people and at the Stoa. And Raven, who's one of the STAR facilitators here, she knows I talk about sort of how I almost get, it's not really triggered, but just sort of like an annoyance with sort of the disembodied, you know, like the galaxy brains and the sense making space, where they speak in such a way where you do not feel the words.
Yeah.
You know, like and this is why I think when we first started talking, I felt an instant kinship and philia with you, because you have great sensitivity and there's like a natural embodiment, I think, due to your boxing background and all that type of stuff, where I can feel you, not just, you know, think you in a way. And And it is interesting with I like this term, I don't know who coined it, but like the trauma scene. We're like in a trauma scene because we have all this like trauma that happened to us,
Mm-hmm.
you know, through our ancestors and whatnot. And I do have an appreciation for, even though there's criticism that rightfully could be thrown on them, Extinction Rebellion, because they talk a lot about like how you have to deal with your individual trauma in order to deal with the collective trauma. And they actually like engage with Dominic Barter's restorative circles together as a group. I don't know how effective they are with that, but that's sort of like a practice to deal with trauma that's going around. And you know, like I feel it, man. It's like there's like a desire to be enmeshed. Like enmeshment issues come online when certain people, you're interacting with certain people, they maybe project things onto you, or you start projecting things onto them. And you know, deep down, it's unhealthy if you want to engage in that, but it's tempting to engage in that. It's seductive even. Um, so I'm curious, like when you're in the wild and when we're not in these sort of like wisely artificial constraints like circling or
Right.
you know, empathy circles or whatever, how do you call attention to that trauma at play?
Yeah, no, that's an amazing question, man, and it's something I really struggle with. The vast majority of my social network isn't into this kind of more conscious, circling, transparent communication space. A lot of my background, like finance, and I'm back in Scotland just now for quarantine, and you know, you guys might have school friends who are like rolling their eyes every time you talk about consciousness or things like that. I think there's a couple of things to say. The first is I believe that the form of leadership that has to and is trying to emerge is the type of leader who is able to go back to those more blue collar communities and actually try this stuff on and almost be like, okay, I might get ridiculed, I might get shamed, especially if you're a dude. But it's like, what happens if I am able to tap into that? But I want to make a distinction. I've lived in San Francisco for 3 years. The fluffy, bypassy, like San Francisco scene of like, let's just share our feelings all the time triggers the fuck out of me. It's really not what I'm advocating for here. And so I do believe there's a certain synthesis between being embodied with this certain sense of bringing trauma into relation without being naive. And I think onto the second point, when we speak about naive, I think my initial attempts to start to articulate this stuff was quite naive, and to some degree may still be. And this kind of links to truth. I believe trauma and truth are deeply interconnected. I thought that if I were just to be able to bring into the world me like telling the truthfulness of my experience at all times, that would be like the cure. But I've learned, you said like these wisdom artificial spaces, Peter. The prerequisite for true emotional vulnerability or true trauma holding in relation is safety. And I wish it wasn't. And so we're kind of holding this paradox of, okay, yes, how do we actually embody these new ways of being wherever we are, while at the same time realizing that to genuinely tap into the depths of truth of your experience, that takes a very, very safe container. I don't know if you guys have heard of Thomas Hubel, Hubel. He's a wisdom teacher, trauma teacher. I'm part of his 2-year training, man, and it's been completely transformative to be in a wee space of 150 people right at the Dunbar number, where for a 2-year process, you're actually tapping in and practicing these ways of being. So to summarize, I think we have to have the courage to try it in day-to-day life, but at the same time being sensible that there actually has to be safety, and that takes time.
A few thoughts come online there. So some of my best friends, like actually my best friend who lives in Vancouver right now, he's like a fucking wild man. And he has no idea about any of this. If I said the word meta to him, he's like, what are you talking about? Like he's not plugged into the scene in an intellectual, philosophical way. And there's like a blue collar kind of energy about him. It's natural thumos. And we just get drunk together, laugh, you know, it's great. And you and I, we're talking about like how, you know, we're going to Bali, we're going to get shit faced together. And then that blue collar kind of humor
You
comes
never
online.
came, dude. You never came.
I know. I got scared. And even when I was introducing you, gushing about your handsomeness, I got kind of like, oh, a little self-conscious because I was going to that blue collar humor, and I know sort of like I'm sensitive to all these different perspectives in the culture war, and I'm friends with a lot of the perspectives. You know, I'm a believer in social justice, all this type of stuff, and I'm careful with my words because I don't want to make certain people feel unsafe. Let's put it that way. I don't want to go out of my way to make them feel unsafe. But I'll risk making people feel unsafe if I think it's the wise thing to do, but I don't want to go out of my way. So I try to speak, at least in a public format, where I'm sensitive to all the reality tunnels at play here.
Right.
And like, so I just wanted to bookmark that for now. And then going to back these artificial sort of wise modalities, let's put it that way, like circling and restorative circles, empty circles. They're really good, I find, in order to.
Well, how can you use the word artificial? It's an interesting one.
Maybe it's like consciously manufactured. Maybe that's a better phrase to put it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like consciously designed. Maybe that's a better way to put it instead of artificial.
Because what I would suggest, man, is the thing that we're currently doing in relation is the thing that's artificial.
Yep.
The complete suppression of what is true feels more artificial to me than these spaces where we permission ourselves to speak more freely.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that in spirit. And so these kind of spaces that are consciously designed, I noticed, like, this is my sense of the two moves that are needed, and I want to see what you think. There has to be like a minimal viable sovereignty at play. The individuals involved need to be individuated enough in order for this coherence or communitas to come online in a very deep felt sense way. If it's not, if there's more than one people that, let's say, are not psychologically developed in that way, in the Keegan level or whatever you want to call it, then the group collapses.
Right. Yeah. All it takes is one.
So is that your experience? Is that your sense of the correct movement as well?
Yeah, that seems right. Yeah.
And so now, like, jumping to the wild, you know, where you said the conversations are artificial. And the way I interpret that is that people adopt intersubjective games that they're unconscious of.
Yeah.
So like, let's say if you're like with a disagreeable asshole and he disagrees with you, and then you're like, okay, I got to play with this game. And then we're like, the gorilla comes in, you start beating your chest. But, you know, if you're good at meta communication, you can kind of like do some judo moves, aikido moves around that. You don't have to play that game if you're skilled in that area. But a lot of people adopt certain frames of intersocial interactions that, you know, are not to the service of themselves or to others.
Well, they're not in service, but I do believe that no matter what kind of adult behavioral game you see playing out, was one time a very intelligent function at a much younger age.
Yeah.
And so this goes back to the developmental trauma piece. When you see your kind of like guerrilla barman, like guy who's coming in and he's looking for a fight on a Friday night in a bar, you know, he's really, his 6 or 7 year old is looking for a fight after he was, you know, badly beaten or something along those lines. So I think an important an important way to frame this, and I don't want to be naive with it because there is malevolence, there is evil. Let's not pretend that problem isn't there.
Yeah.
But a lot of it is, I believe that if we can do the developmental trauma work and integrate the 6, 7, 8-year-old part of ourselves, so that energy that is trying to express itself in the nervous system is able to come to rest. And we don't need to persistently compensate because we're actually trying to avoid some of the most primal emotions of sadness, anger, and fear.
Mm-hmm. And so just for the people in the room, like Josh and I can go all day about this type of stuff. So if you have any questions, throw them in the chat box and we'll take it in. And so your life work is pretty much this so far, or at least when you kind of made that switch away from finance. And there's a focus on technology. So maybe can you tell us about like the strategies that you're personally using or advocating for?
Yeah. Well, as it pertains to what exact part?
Addressing trauma in an interpersonal context.
Yeah. Yeah. So like I said, I believe that from my own experience, I'll be pretty it's pretty clear to me that being in a persistent we space with the same group of people over a prolonged period of time that has a certain transmission. You can do the Luminous Institute in California, you can do Thomas Hubel in Europe. There's a few of these things that are popping up. And that's been the most powerful for me personally. There's also obviously the realms of psychedelics and contemplative practice. I feel like contemplative practice doesn't really work on the trauma piece, and I'll explain why. I thought that in order to transcend some of these most deeply held issues, these were just expressions of a dysfunctional mind. And if I were to just optimize the mind, go on 10-day Vipassana retreats, that could somehow solve for these kind of deeper childhood issues. What Thomas says is that, well, all trauma is fundamentally relational. And so trauma has to be healed in relation. And so that's why if you guys have seen people who've done 100 ayahuasca ceremonies, but they're no fucking different, right? Part of the reason with that, in my sense, is because they're doing these inward journeys of the subjective without the necessary cultivation of the intersubjective. I'm really seeing that more and more in the psychedelic space, the kind of psychedelic narcissism, which Ali Boehner speaks about, and we've spoken about, Peter. It's like once you see it, you're like, there we are. A big interest for me with technology. So I've been running a community called Consciousness Hacking in the Bay Area for the last year and a half. We're a global community, but our HQ is in SF. And what makes me particularly excited about this intersection of consciousness and technology is if we are able to start to measure the objective data of trauma, from brainwaves to heart rate variability to physiological stress responses to galvanic skin response to just pure breath rate. If we are able to measure that objectively and get a really good sense as to what is actually going on in the body from a third person perspective when someone was traumatized or when they're contracted, we can theoretically begin to build tools that could help people titrate some of that trauma out of their system. So for example, I believe that the consciousness hacking space will soon be able to realize tools that, for example, if someone is holding a trauma contraction in their belly, and that contraction is an intelligent function because it's stopping an overwhelming sensation that was previously suppressed, a lot of people can't access those areas, right? When you say, what do you feel? Well, you don't feel anything. It can take people a long, long time to get in touch with those core wounds. I think that science and technology is going to be able to help us in the distant future. I don't know how long, 10, 15, 20 years, to begin to come into contact with those contractions and begin to release some of those deeply held emotions. So I'm not using, even though I'm working in the tech scene, I was working in the tech scene, I'm not using that for my own trauma journey, but I think it has a ton of potential moving forward.
Yeah, so much to go down there. And I kind of want to inquire too about, I'm sure you're familiar with Ken Wilber's integral life practice framework, and then John Vervaeke's ecology of practices, how we have to have a wise balance there. And I'm actually a adjunct researcher at John's Consciousness and Wisdom Studies Lab. And the whole idea is to bring a wisdom gem forth that has an ecology of practices that can address all these areas. So that kind of spiritual psychedelic narcissism doesn't come online. So I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts about the cultivation of ecology of practices? And then I'll turn to the questions in the chat box.
Well, I'm actually not from, I know I've heard Vervaeke say that as a theme. I don't know like the precise specifics.
It's like, so you have a meditative spiritual practice, but also you do shadow work, trauma work, then you do like weightlifting, then you do like journal writing, whatever. So you have an ecology that kind of makes you a sovereign individual, that primes you for communitas.
Yeah. So the way I look at that is Ken Wilber's wake up, grow up, clean up, show up.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'll just give it a brief overview in case people haven't heard of it. Ken Wilber says there are 4 stages to consciousness evolution. The first stage is waking up. And what waking up is, it is the movement from the gross and separate perception of reality to more of an interdependent, unitive, subtle consciousness. And if you are in the kind of psychedelic or the tech circles, how you might perceive spiritual awakening is focused on the waking up component of consciousness evolution. It's about getting non-dual, getting there quick, transcending suffering, there you go. And I see a lot of that in Silicon Valley, by the way. Like, that's a real fucking problem with building these tools. Like, it's a real problem. That's the waking up, but there's also growing up. So growing up refers to the vertical development stages. So you mentioned Keegan before. You've also got spiral dynamics. So 70% of the world are ego or ethnocentric stages of development, according to adult development theory. That means that 70% of the world are most concerned with themselves and or their kin, tribe, religion, community. And what adult development theory suggests is that there are stages above this where one is able to include more complexity and more perspectives. So green, teal, whatever you want to call it. And so I think it's also really important to say, how are we moving along that vertical trajectory? And everyone wants to be higher and stuff, but
right.
And then there's just, sorry, Pete, just to finish off, and then there's cleaning up, which is healing trauma and doing shadow work, and then showing up, which is how are you actually showing up in the world. I was listening to a podcast by Dan Brown today, and his whole thing is like the fruits. It's like the fruits of awakening are seen in their actions, something along with that. Like if you're having an interior experience of non-duality, but it isn't manifesting itself in more benevolent behavior, you haven't actually moved up the path of awakening.
All right, so let's go to the questions for the next 30 minutes. Rain, could you ask your question?
Yeah, thanks. I was just wondering if you could articulate more precisely what that relationship is between truth and trauma. There was a part you were saying that something about letting your truth come out or trauma getting in the way of that. Would just love to hear more about the relationship between those two.
Yeah, so what I believe trauma does to our nervous systems is it leads to a fragmentation between thought, emotion, and sensation. So I might be telling you, hey, I'm scared, right? And I'm cognitively telling you I'm scared. But if I'm not actually feeling my fear or feeling the physical sensation of the heart beating in my chest, I'm not actually in truth with you, or I'm not actually being fully truthful with you. I'm being truthful from the perspective of fragmentation. And so when we speak about like the word integrity, like integrity is us being able to speak from what is true cognitively, emotionally, and somatically at the same time. And I think that what trauma does is, because it fragments our nervous system, it pulls us into the head. Maybe a lot of us, that's our pattern. My pattern is to go into my head. We lose touch with emotional and physical truth. And I think that is what creates incoherence in our relational fields.
So I hear in that you value congruence and truth, like being able to speak, be embodied enough that you're speaking your truth when you're interacting with others.
Yeah, and to reframe, if you're not embodied enough, you're not actually transmitting what is deeply truthful.
And it's important to transmit what's deeply truthful.
In order to build deep, and this is my experience, that when I'm able to touch into those 3 layers of truth and they align, something seems to happen in my relations. Like a much deeper coherence goes. And I think it's interesting, like even if you feel into this group field, right? Watch when our attention goes away and watch when it comes back, like as a group. And we can kind of sense that. And I noticed that if we move into more heady, less embodied speech, coherence tends to diminish. Yeah.
Totally. Raven, you had a question?
Hi, thanks Joshua for being here. Yeah, my question was about essentially I've seen in my world like a lot of communities that were centered around trauma practices, and sometimes they seem to kind of go off the rails a little bit into this kind of narcissistic cycle of everything becoming trauma,
Mm.
everything like becoming about the process of dealing with trauma. And so I guess in some way like an over application of that as a sense making tool. But then there also seems to be a part of this that is when a group comes together and like practitioners are trauma oriented and that's what they do, they kind of have an incentive to find trauma in places where maybe it may not be the best level of engagement. And I see that as being a possible pitfall of communities coming together for the purpose of dealing with trauma, that it may become an overly applied tool. What do you think about that conundrum?
Yeah. Yeah, almost like it becomes the lens, and so you see everything through the trauma lens, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It's a hammer.
Yeah, I get that. And I also get there's a kind of not all negative loops should be entertained. Like some of them are negative loops because they're negative loops, not because they're undigested emotion.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, I really hear you in that. I don't have do you know Roger Walsh? He's a wisdom teacher.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote one of the kind of some of the like classic like books on spirituality, and he's just like fuck this trauma stuff. Like he's like it's about well-being and you don't actually have to digest trauma to cultivate positive mind. I think why I'm emphasizing it here is because there's so much there's and Peter speaks to this like the liminal war, the culture war. There's so much fragmentation in our information ecology. Like we're needing something to actually bring us back into coherence. And I think that we're trying to come back into coherence through reason. But you know, the pandemic YouTube film got halfway across the world before anyone could even argue against it rationally. So I think it's just a missing component of the sense making conversation, but it isn't the full component. And I totally agree that we can get lost in it.
Great. Thank you.
Cool. I actually finally watched that pandemic thing last night. I fell
Yeah.
asleep halfway through, so it's pretty good. Pretty good to put to bed. Maslow's hammer comes to mind. You know, like if you have a hammer, everything's a nail. And so if you have some kind of epistemic authority in one domain, sometimes it bleeds over to other domains and you act like an authority when you really shouldn't. And I was writing in the chat box, it's like there's a difference between an unconscious hierarchy versus a conscious hierarchy. And when you can kind of have that meta communicative abilities where you can play with not only the content, but with the agenda, then you can say, okay, right now we're listening to someone who has legitimate expertise in this area, and we're going to defer to them during this context, during this moment. And if done right, I don't think there's anything unhealthy about that. It's only when that becomes unconscious and it carries over to different domains when it shouldn't. That's when I think it gets pathological. So I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I think part of the old version is a kind of like so I don't, when I speak about masculine feminine or masculine feminine energy, like I don't necessarily mean them ontologically, like there are these real things that are operating as principles, but I kind of do. And I think the whole notion of like the rise of the feminine, we've all heard that, right? Like we need the feminine. I think part of that is a quality of leadership that doesn't try to impose. And really the quality of leadership that tries to impose, like the pharaohs all the way to CEOs, all the way to Mr. Trump, I just think that is not, it's no longer appropriate for our current predicament, which is so emergent, so uncertain, so fragile, and so adaptive, that if we try to kind of do that thing, it's not going to work. So I think if these like hierarchies do get, epistemic hierarchies emerge, but from this emergent place rather than this I know and I'm going to tell everyone else what to do, I think that is different. I really do.
Luke, you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question, and then I also have a just like offering to all of this that I think is really interesting if you're up for it. So the question is, I don't know if people here are familiar with the work of Ian McGilchrist and the whole idea of, you know, kind of the over-reductionist world that we live in, because of the imbalance into the like cortical structures of the left hemisphere of the brain. And that if not, there's like an 11-minute RSA video that speeds through a 650-page book. That to me, in these conversations around trauma, what can be really complicated is like semantically, we can start to talk about concepts and constructs that, because we may not have an understanding of the complexity of them, we'll overly reduce them into like, oh, that's a thing, that's this thing. And the question is, you know, how to reconcile that and keep, you know, on the other side of that, this idea of there is lots of trauma that is, trauma operates neurobiologically below the order of language. And so now that we use language kind of and try to top down into an understanding of it from language, how do we reconcile that with the bottom up of the body intelligence that like we never will be able to put words to?
Yeah. Yeah, I've read McGilchrist, and he lives in Scotland, so I like him purely because of that. Well, one thing I don't necessarily agree with, Luke, is that we're trying to penetrate trauma through language. I think language is it's a shared communication tool for people like us in these relationships. We haven't quite mastered the art of telepathy yet. But in my own experience, like the integration of trauma and the digestion of trauma is completely nonverbal. It is actually the capacity to bring undigested sensation into presence. And this is where we lean a little bit more esoterically, that bringing it into presence dissolves it. And so I don't actually think I don't think we're trying to get there through language.
No, I appreciate that. And I feel like for me, the concern in this space that I have just in this is more to like the SF burner crowd than to like our group here.
Yeah.
But is the like, there are people who will try to do that. And that there's this like what you mentioned at the beginning, kind of in that sense-making space, but like the lack of coherence to embodied expression. And that's something that, yeah, for me, I've had lots of conversations similarly where it's like, you can rationalize on this very well. Right. This is not a rational process. And just if I may, so like I've been reading a lot of Campbell recently. I don't know if this will...
Is that The Power of Myth? I can't see it. Is that The Power of Myth?
Yeah. And there's a great, he talks about metaphor, and he talks about like the internal experience, which to me kind of trauma as a stagnation and a fracturing of internal experience. And he talks about how, just talking about like the commonality of these myths, and is like, it's utterly fascinating because they are speaking about the deep mystery of yourself and everything else. It is a mysterium, a mystery, tremendum et fascinans, tremendous, horrific, because it smashes all your fixed notions of things, and at the same time utterly fascinating because it's of your own nature and being. When you start thinking about these things, about the inner mystery, inner life, the eternal life, there aren't too many images for you to use. You begin on your own to have the images that are already present in some other system of thought. So I just thought that was really relevant to our conversation today, of the like, we may use somebody else's system to try and get at what is actually ours to reconcile with.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. And also, just to flag, that's the only book that I've ever read back to cover and then started again on page 1. So a nice synchronistic choice.
Cool. So Mary, you had a question?
Is that me, Mary?
Yeah, Mary, I believe you had a question.
Oh, okay. I think Raven's question addressed it. But I would say hearing the description of the we space, it sounds like we're sort of arbitrating between cerebral robots and traumatized children and trying to create safe space for it. And in my, I don't know, in what I'm seeing we need in the world in terms of embracing future is getting comfortable with uncertainty. And that requires not safety and kind of letting go of the rail and embracing what's coming, and that maybe there's something different with what's emerging that can create coherence and truth looking forward if we let go of all those rails. That's a thought.
Do you think, though, that the fear of uncertainty as an adult is actually the echo of the fear of the child?
It could be. I also think sort of evolutionary biology, we are pattern seekers and like the comfort of existing patterns. And that could also be causing the trauma, discomfort with the new. And
yeah, my thing with this, Mary, is it's not as if this is a magic bullet, right? Like if we just solve for this, like we'd be able, you know, we're going to have to come across like fearful, uncertain situations. From my own experience with this is, the digestion of emotion, that's such a deep layer from such an early age, increases our nervous system's capacity to hold more intense emotions that might come in as an adult. It's more like we have a cup here, and rather the cup being this size, the trauma work enlarges the cup, so you get this cup. And so then your vessel is a better conduit of a transmission of a higher emotion or energy. And so that's when I think that how trauma is playing out, it's because we don't, our nervous systems haven't cultivated that capacity to hold the fear that inevitably comes from uncertainty and novelty.
totally agree. I guess it probably comes down to the responsibility, where the responsibility lies. And I could see like creating spaces to have and see and explore how the collective could address that. I guess I'd also like to see spaces that maybe manage that in a different way. And maybe that's my own trauma, trying to avoid the pain of dealing with trauma.
Mind is a clever thing. Yeah.
Oh, it's fascinating. Tricky little bugger. Thank you. Thank you for this talk too. It's been great.
Thanks, Mary.
So we're approaching our time, a lot of time. So let's have one more question. Manik, you had a question.
Hi, thank you. Yes, to echo Mary Lou, this is super important to have heard this today. Thank you so much, Joshua. I've been going through this process for the last 2 years of retraining myself to feel the things are blocked because of trauma. So a lot of this is resonating because I've just lived it. And I was just wondering, because I am trying to look at games and things that help, but what do you think in general to the group, but also to Joshua, is I feel like we need a way to integrate some sort of trauma processing education at different stages for people in general. Like, what do you think of that aspect? I mean, that the potential of scaling, what it means to help people navigate trauma in the way that we use, you know, history and geography as education in systems. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, so that's the very question that got me into the consciousness hacking space, which is that, okay, how do you scale higher consciousness? And then when you think of the word scale, well, what do you think about? You think about technology. Lo and behold, people are thinking about scaling consciousness, higher states and stages of consciousness through technology. So I think there's a couple of things to this. The first is, one potential avenue, Monique, is through tech. And a lot of people have a hell of a resistance to that, right? But if you want to democratize and make universally accessible tools for trauma, you're not going to get people going in long retreats, long wee spaces, 2-year programs if they've got 3 kids and they live in a developing country. And it's not going to happen. I think that there are a lot of people, that's not fully true. There are some people who are curious about technology's place in this particular piece of the consciousness puzzle. And like I said initially, like if you're able to map what trauma looks like in the body, so objectively, you will be able to create tools that can actually bring people's nervous systems into harmony and release some of the undigested emotion. But that's the bottom up, right? And I've been bottom up for the last few years, and we're all in this kind of emergent sense making space, and everyone doesn't like the idea. A lot of people don't like the idea of acting top down. But that's one of the easiest ways where I see us making an impact here. It's literally targeting 200 people with this type of work. That's one way to scale this because of the trickle-down effect of that.
Thank you. You just confirmed that it's okay to do what I'm doing. I was actually trying to build a game, an emotional support game that navigates people through some of what I navigated and some of what I feel like kids that I worked with in my life seem to navigate. And I was just, always looking sometimes for validation because sometimes most people don't get it. And the level, you mentioned trauma, it's just complete, it's too much. So thanks for saying that. I think games have a lot of space. Play as a tech tool has space, but it's about doing it consciously and not doing it, superficially. Thank you. I don't want to take any more time, but yeah.
Thank you, Monique. Yeah, I think we do need a new language around this, actually. Peter, can I just say a couple of things just to...
Yeah, please.
I mean, the intention here was to talk a little bit more. The rabbit hole became about trauma, which is super. But there was also this thing around truth and truthfulness. And Jacob, I'm going to quote Schmachtenberger, as Jacob's here. I'm going to quote Schmachtenberger just to tease you. But he makes this important distinction between truth and truthfulness. And so let's not deny that if we're speaking truthfully, it does not necessarily mean we're speaking the truth. But I think we're in this sense-making space together, right? And part of my intention for coming in here is like, where do I see the highest input, the highest output for the minimal input? And I think it's 2 points. It's developing trauma and healing trauma and actually speaking truthfully in relationships. And if you look at the mess of our information ecology and all of all these competing claims and narratives in the liminal wars, I think part of that breeding ground is a consequence of a cultural movement away from truthfulness. It's been said that Asian cultures put face over truth. And I think in a lot of in our kind of Western century of narcissism, we've also had this movement away from truthfulness and towards what makes our egos feel good. And then you've also got the Nietzschean postmodern slant, right? That has definitely had a kind of trickle down effect on there being competing claims for reality. But here's my more esoteric thing, which is that I believe that when we align ourselves subjectively with a certain principle, be it truthfulness, be it discipline, be it love, that is how the universal ideal manifests in the particular. So that the transpersonal Platonian ideals or forms, the way that they actually manifest in the world is through using the human individual as their expression. And so that when we lean into things like truthfulness or love, we're actually aligning with a deeper transpersonal force. I don't say this often because I don't think many people they think I'm nuts. But this isn't just about information ecology, coherency. I do believe that this is actually, we've lost sight of a deeper principle of reality. And Jordan Peterson speaks to this, right? Like if you tell the truth, like reality is on your side. And when you don't, it's against you. And then it's all an uphill battle from there. So,
Yeah, that should be another session all on its own. Just this exercising this truthfulness muscle and how come it's so hard. So before we close out, do you have any kind of final words, my friend? I can watch you being pensive all day though, so that's okay if you don't.
Contemplative look, Peter. No, I mean the thing that actually came up is like this is a really I mean I've not participated in Stoa sessions before, but like this is really like a really quality, coherent group that's obviously like tapping into something here that isn't the kind of San Francisco stuff. It's I don't know, it feels a certain grounded realism.
We're getting that a lot. There's like sort of like a bias against Stoicism. But there's only like 2 Stoics actually in this space, like me and Daniel. Everyone else is not really Stoic. So it's like a
Stoic.
he's not here right now. He's not here. You like him, but most people are not Stoics in this space. So there's like a bait and switch there with the title. But that being said, I'm gonna utilize all my charm game to seduce you back to the Stoa as soon as possible. So prepare for that, my friend. And thank you so much for coming to the Stoa today. It was lovely.
Much, I really appreciate it. And thanks, guys.
And we'll have this video posted this evening for those who want to watch it again. A couple of people said they already want to watch it again, which is awesome. So upcoming events, we just to make some announcements. We have one in 30 minutes. Raven, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you probably can explain this one better than I could, relational exegesis. Would you mind explaining that one?
Yeah, sure. So this is kind of an experimental technique for engaging with a text with a group of people, and it's combining like reading out loud with like a commenting and editing process on a Google document, which allows for like different channels of communication and conversation to emerge from engaging with the written word. So today we're going to be reading Impro, which is a fantastic text, and I think it will inspire a lot of interesting conversation. You don't have to come with any preparation. We read there in the session, and last week it was really amazing and generative. So I would definitely invite everybody to come. It was a good time.
Yep, that's hosted by Freyja or Jessica. It's going to be really awesome. And would you want to plug tomorrow's event, the speed dating thing, Socratic speed dating, Raven?
Sure, yeah. For those of you who don't know, I've been weekly doing a Socratic speed dating event, and this week we're going to have Ayla, who basically designed a question game, come in right before the session to talk about her inspiration for the game and some of the things that she's learned through basically creating and asking people controversial questions over the last decade of her life. And then we're going to pivot to a game, playing this game, Ask Cole, which is, yeah, it's a very interesting kind of social boundary breaking game, and everyone should totally come and play it. It's super fun.
Yeah, it's dangerous too, because like I'm really exercising my truthfulness muscle in a public way with the journals and the Stoa, and they ask you some dangerous questions. So if you want to plug into that, it's really fun. And then tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern time, Clyde Rathbone. You'd like Clyde, Josh. He's like this former, like he was like the rugby player in Australia, and he created a letter platform. He's coming tonight, and he's talking about my letter writing exercise and how it's a spiritual Stoic practice and how we can kind of scale it up and whatnot. So RSVP to that. Go to the website, check out the events, sign up the mailing list, and check out the gift economy. That being said, everyone, thanks so much for coming today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.